Good morning. I hope you all can hear me. I feel like I'm doing CALI radio here. I'm in room 325 broadcasting to all you wonderful people out there in Suffolk University Law School land. There's actually a funny story behind this, which our plenary speaker will be elaborating on. But he's in a hotel in Washington, D.C., actually in Virginia, dealing with canceled airplanes, tornado warnings at Dulles Airport, and other problems. So we've done a little bit of rapid jury rigging with the fine help of the media services folks at Suffolk in order to, nevertheless, the show must go on, bring you this presentation. First I want to take care of some housekeeping things. Yes, the luggage room will be open till 5 p.m. They've provided us with a security guard with a large weapon, so your materials will be safe until you come to pick them up. Lyle Baker wants me to remind you that at noon or at the lunch break, there will be a demo in the simulation room, which is in room 555 for any of you who were unable to attend the other 2 days or who are interested. And any speakers who borrowed cables or inadvertently picked them up, would you please return them to media services before you go? You can either bring them to room 330 or hand them off to anybody with a blue badge. All right. So let's get started. Our plenary speaker this year on Saturday is Jerry Neece. Jerry Neece of Sun Microsystems. He's the director of academic programs. And this is a bit unusual. It's the first time we've ever had a plenary speaker come back. And there's a good reason for it. Jerry, of course, works for Sun, which is a .com company. And last year, if you may remember, he gave a very enthusiastic and exuberant talk in the midst of the internet bubble, you might say. And I thought it would be more than appropriate to have him come back and sort of bracket that talk with, what's going on now, a year later. And we've, as I said before, he had some problems with airplane connections and things like that. Actually, I think it's because Sun couldn't afford to put him on an airplane or something like that. But he'll explain that a little bit better. And without much further ado, I'd like to introduce Jerry Neece.
Well, thank you very much, John, and I would certainly like to thank the folks at the Media Center there at Suffolk for making this happen. I noticed you said this was the first time you were inviting a speaker to come back, and I'm actually not physically there, I'm only virtually there, but I certainly do thank the Media Services folks and you, John, for taking this experiment here and having this happen, because, this is actually using a networking technology as well. This is using a technology that's been in place about 125 years now, and it works rather well, but it works in conjunction with social interaction, and that's one of the points I'll be making here in a few minutes. But I think it's rather funny. I actually started trying to get up there about 1:30 in the afternoon yesterday, and we finally gave up at the airport about 11:30 p.m. and got back here to the hotel about 1:30 a.m. So I'm ready to go here, really, and I'm really looking forward to the opportunity of talking with you there. I wish I could be there. I have certainly a preference to Boston and the Beltway, and Pablo, I'm sure that you would probably agree with that. It's a much better atmosphere up there in Boston than it is down here right now. But let's go ahead and start talking about this here. I'm actually sitting here in a hotel room looking into a mirror, and one of those phrases that you used to hear about the internet is, on the internet, no one can tell you're a doc. And I'm also sure that you've heard the phrase, when you get nervous in front of people, pretend like they're all out there naked in front of you. And I sort of combined those because I'm sitting here at a desk looking into a mirror of me naked, because my bags are on the way to Boston, but unfortunately I'm not. So that's just what we're going to have to deal with today. But I do appreciate John inviting me to come back and talk about this sort of taking stock of the internet and the opportunities for law schools and in the teaching of law after this .com bubble burst. And so, actually, if you can go to the next foil, John, I would just like to remind them who Sun Microsystems is. We were the company that last year, when I was up on stage, claimed that we're the dot in .com. And we've actually modified that phrase a little bit here this year. And now, as you can see, we're the old in the old economy. So let's go ahead and and take a look at the agenda here, because John asked, as I said, asked me to talk about some of the changes and what really happened and what we can expect here. So the agenda I'm going to go through here for the session here is to talk a little bit about my perspective of what really happened out there, and to talk a little bit about what's happening now in terms of the internet and the web, and then to take some more time and talk about 6 directions that still make sense for law schools to look at when it comes to technology. Take a look at some of the issues that still remain to be dealt with, and close with some final thoughts there. But as you remember last year, those of you that came, I ended up with a foil that was called Looking to the Future, and I said that the only thing predictable is change, and massive change comes from unknown directions. And therefore you should re-engineer your schools and your faculty and your students and your technological infrastructure and even your alumni fundraising for this concept of agility. Now, at the time I talked last June, I had no idea of seeing what was going to happen between then and now, but it's certainly something that none of us expected, and something that even my chairman, Scott McNeely, last month said, when someone asked him about if we'd seen the bottom of the high-tech fall, he said, and I quote, "People are claiming that they're seeing the bottom. I don't know where they're getting that data. They certainly didn't see the cliff, so how in the world can they see the bottom?" And certainly from our perspective in Silicon Valley and high-tech, we didn't see this coming at all. I think the first indications I heard of it in my job were probably in the late November, early December timeframe last year. And I'm continually reminded that was the time by my wife, who told me we should have sold our stock at 120 instead of its current price of around $14.13. But, in retrospect, that's something that you wish you'd learned. So, John, if you could go to the next slide there, I'd actually like to look at what really happened here. And you're all probably familiar with this concept of herd mentality. And this is just probably one of the greatest examples of herd mentality that we ever saw here, because basically it was the bulls in Wall Street that shit on the dot-coms. And as recently as May 23rd, John Rutledge from Evergreen Technology Fund was telling people that the biggest sin of all is not to be invested in an up market, trying to convince people back on May 23rd that we were at the bottom and on the way back up. And of course, at that time, Sun went from 16 to 23 and back to 14. So this, again, is an example of the people in the investment houses and things like that trying to make their business plans work by encouraging us all to ante up at the bottom of the market and get back in, because it's the biggest sin of all to be left out. And then as Dr. James Martin said, the herd mentality is agile because of the instantaneous access to information around the world. And so you can see how the internet and the web itself have contributed to this herd mentality as it applies to this particular situation here. And there was even a comment from Dr. Charles Leitzer over in the UK, and he said, hence the greater uncertainty and the higher the stakes involved, the more vulnerable people become to herd mentality. And given the uncertainty and the anxiety which they often cause, it's not surprising that money, finance, and investing can render people prone to herd mentality and herd behavior. And it's not a new phenomenon. I mean, I remember a song back from the 60s called, I Heard It to the Grapevine. But if we go to the next point, we'll take a look at what really happened. I think that most of what we trace at Sun Microsystems in terms of our revenues can be traced back to the problems of the telco ISP market. And what happened to the telcos and the ISPs that caused them to have the problems that have started affecting the rest of us. And I think if you look at the situation, you'll see that there was a very heavy debt load on the part of telcos, and they have no money now, and that's why they're not spending money on buying new things. But the reason they have that debt load is for 2 reasons, I believe. And the first has to do with network expansion. While flying on the plane to Washington earlier in the week, I read that in the United States right now there are 39 million miles of fiber optic cable laid around the country. 39 million miles, enough to circle the globe over 5,000 times. But the interesting thing about that is less than 3% of that is actually being used right now, and that's not even incorporating the technologies of dense wave multiplexing and division, which will allow a single strand of fiber to increase its capacity just by multiplexing different colors of light at either end. So we've got this massive infrastructure that people built, expecting the internet to explode even more wildly than it did, and now they've got all this infrastructure out there they need to start paying for. And I think the other thing that actually impacted many telcos and ISPs was the wireless licenses. And I'll talk about wireless in a few minutes here. And of course, if you have any questions on wireless, you ought to just go search out Mitch Davis there in the audience. He'd be happy to tell you about his experience of it.
But in terms of the telcos and wireless licenses, many of these people were forced to spend millions, if not billions of dollars to buy licenses, particularly in Europe, in the 3G networks, and don't have any opportunity to recoup that investment for the next year, 2 or 3, perhaps. And so, again, these are the sources that the debt came from, and I think that the debt in the telcos was actually the thing that sort of started tipping things off as it came to the high-tech industry. Now, the second thing that happened had to do with the stock market. You know, the interesting thing is, way back when I was in Los Angeles, back in the early 1970s, there was an individual there I knew in my apartment building that was an investor, and he tried to convince me that if you just look at the marketplace from a cyclical perspective, you'll see that it goes up and down and up and down, and individual events don't necessarily affect it, but there's certainly a cyclicality in the marketplace. Of course, I didn't believe it then, and that's why I'm still poor. But there are even companies in Silicon Valley that have seen this cyclical trend in the stock market and even built it into their logo. And you'll certainly see that Cisco Systems is one of those companies that you can actually see that dip in their stock price built right into their logo there. They try to convince you that that's the Golden Gate Bridge, but really that's their stock price. So if we can go to the next foil here and look at what other things that really happened. Certainly from my perspective as teaching electronic commerce at the University of Santa Clara Business School, Graduate Business School, there were certainly a lot of very poor business plans generated out there by a lot of people that were really undereducated entrepreneurs in the first place. And as you saw from many of these business plans, and it's certainly something that's been criticized a lot afterwards, is that none of these business plans had a really good idea of how to generate revenue. And so I think what you see is in another way there, that many dot-coms were interesting experiments in venture capitalism and not necessarily in the best uses of the internet. There was an individual by the name of Jonathan Weber who pointed out recently that in the late months of the year 2000, many companies had very little choice but to act as if insanity were a normal thing. And if venture capital money is there for the taking, you take it. And if you have to pay crazy prices to get the best people or a decent office space, you pay it. And if you're an investor, you play. And the alternative is sitting on the sidelines, and nobody ever got anywhere doing that. And certainly I think that, last year, the hype of the internet reached very, very high proportions. And many companies that I talked to as they came through California on their corporate visits told me that they were getting into the internet and the web because they felt they had no choice, that their competitors were doing it, and gosh, if I don't get in it now, I'll just be left behind forever and probably be out of business. And so many people reacted to this insanity and went out and spent money probably where they shouldn't have. I think one of the greatest indications of this is the fact that at one time there were 6 major pet websites where you could buy dog food and cat food and things like that. And I'm not sure the world needs one pet website, but it certainly doesn't need 6. And the reason that we ended up with 6 is once the first 1 or 2 got funded by venture capitalists, then all the rest of the venture capitalist firms felt that they certainly needed to go out there and find their own pet business on the web. But I think the most important point here, and the point I would like to really base the rest of the presentation on, is that most importantly, the internet didn't disappear, and in fact, it didn't even start to flatten its growth. Although I have heard reports that email traffic actually went down for the first month of last month, particularly in Europe, and I think that can be fairly easily explained by the fact that students left schools in Europe in May, and it just shows how much of internet traffic is actually done by students. And when they leave in May and June in the Northern Hemisphere, internet traffic and things will fall off. I think I discovered that phenomenon most clearly about 5 years ago when I was building my web class on electronic commerce at Santa Clara, and I noticed that when I found a good article that a student had written on a website, you had to take it off that website and copy it yourself by June because the server on which that website and that paper was contained probably went offline in June as well, and so you lost access to many of those good papers unless you actually copied them. So if we could go to the next foil, I'd actually, all of you have heard of Alvin Toffler, and Alvin Toffler did an article back in the Wall Street Journal back on March 29th of this year. And you see these kinds of quotes and articles quite a bit, so I won't go into a great detail except for the last bullet down there. because he says that the high-tech revolution is real. And most alarming, the high-tech revolution is just one stage in an ongoing revolution leading to an entirely new civilization that lies just around the corner. And I truly think that that's where the opportunity for us as educators truly lies, is in reshaping the way learning is done by using the internet and the web appropriately. And I think appropriately is a word that I'll talk about a little bit here later as well. So in talking about how the value of the internet has remained strong, John, if we can go to the next foil there, I'd like to offer a quote by Jonathan Schwartz, who's our Senior Vice President of Corporate Strategy at Sun Microsystems. He recently wrote an article called Rational Exuberance, and in that article he offered the quote you see there that says that the internet is the most undervalued, underappreciated, and underhyped phenomenon since the Industrial Revolution. This sounds a little bit like the same phrases that Eric Schmidt, who used to be with Sun Microsystems and went off to Novell and is now, I believe, with Google, or another firm like that. He talked about it as being the most underhyped phenomenon as well. And certainly there's a point to make that it has been overhyped, but I think that when you look at it from the perspective that Jonathan looks at it, you can see how it is really underhyped. Because let's face it, all of you out there do banking and investing, and there really isn't a bank out there or an investment house or a brokerage that hasn't adopted the internet and the web as a critical piece of their business strategy and in dealing with their customer base. And look at all the people in business that have customer service organizations. And look how those organizations have been helped, and they've been able to save millions and millions of dollars just by doing things like frequently asked questions on websites as opposed to having to talk to a real human being. The government has certainly made excellent use of the web to disseminate information to their constituency, but where they've really had the most savings is they put their forms online, and instead of having to print millions and millions of forms that show up in Social Security offices and things like that around the country, they're able to put all those forms on the web at savings of millions, if not low billions of dollars. And just looking at the hotel and travel industry, how many of you have not booked an airline reservation or a hotel reservation using the internet, or searched or researched where you want to go on your vacation by pulling up information on the web and reading about places? So in the area of retailing, for example, I have a particularly hard time finding the right size of pants for myself. I wear a 36-33, and of course most of the world looks at 36-32s and 36-34s. But I notice I can go to the Land's End website, which operates out of New York, and order a pair of 36-33s that will be delivered to me within 48 hours just by going to the website and ordering. And even at Sun Microsystems, we have certainly saved millions and probably billions of dollars as well, just like Oracle claims that they've saved $1 billion using their own software. In our experience at Sun, we've probably saved in the billions our very first year 6 years ago. One of the most successful early applications we had at Sun was putting patches for the Solaris operating system online instead of having to have our customers call into a customer service desk and a real live person and talk to them to find out what patch they needed, and then put them on some sort of media and FedEx that to them or send it over the internet. By actually putting the patches online so customers themselves could come in, we not only increased their satisfaction because they weren't being put on hold and waiting on the phone for long minutes, we increased their satisfaction and actually got the patch to them sooner. And so it's an interesting kind of business proposition where you can reduce your cost and increase your customer satisfaction at the same time. My interest in the internet early on at Sun, when I was one of the 3 co-founders of www.sun.com, was putting both online ordering and brochures online. Now, brochures, if you look at those, 4-color glossy brochures that you probably all have to hand out to prospective students, those are expensive items. I think the one in particular I was dealing with back then for the Netra cost me $1.03 a piece, and I used to take them off to the trade shows at, $1,000 and $2,000 at a time. That, to me, simply had to change. I got tired of going to trade shows and collecting all the information and stuffing it into these big bags and then trying to check it onto the airline. But for the most part, I thought there would be a true opportunity to have customers go to the website and have their information answered immediately by finding those same kind of brochures online. In that first year at Sun, we also saved millions, tens of millions of dollars in reduced documentation. One of the other 2 people that helped me found Sun.com was actually an engineer from the Solaris group who, if you recently ordered Solaris, you get a box. About 9/10 of the weight and the volume is the documentation that goes with it, and then the CD carries most of what you want. So if there was a way that we could reduce all that bulk inside the product by putting that documentation online, certainly we have the ability to save millions and millions of dollars. And of course, over time, I evolved into the training area and saw the opportunity to save money in training. By actually, first of all, the first year I justified the distance learning engine a distributed learning system, I would probably call it DIG. I cost justified that by reducing travel by about $1.37 million. But over time, we've actually proven that training people faster by giving them the information online they need to do their job can actually result in billions of dollars of increased revenue. And I actually got Ed Zander, our Chief Executive Officer, to admit that probably 3% of the revenue of Sun Microsystems over the last 4 years since we implemented that distance learning system, in his estimation, was attributable to the fact that people used our distributed learning engine Suntan, got the information they needed to close sales sooner, and that was actually worth probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $109 to $125 million of incremental revenue simply by training people faster. So I think that there's a lot of things the internet has actually done in terms of potential cost savings or increasing efficiencies that are so inevitable and irresistible to people that the web was going and the internet were going to happen anyway, despite the fact that they were really overhyped at the start. So there was also, if you look at the things that still make sense, and John, if you could go to the next point, let's start focusing on, after this dot-com bubble burst, what things truly still make sense to look at. And I focused on 6 items here that I'll go into some detail on. But the first thing is, obviously, and I think most importantly, the web and the internet allow us to focus on the learner and to personalize the learning experience to that learner, which increases their satisfaction. The second item is the growing use of wireless access on campus, and certainly we've started to have the opportunity to observe some of the advantages and perhaps challenges of wireless because it's heavy use over in Scandinavia. I'd like to also talk about faculty involvement in IT because I think that's a particularly crucial subject for this audience, and I have some recommendations there. I'd like to talk a little bit about the network computing model for content distribution and consumption because I think, again, like the internet, the efficiencies and the cost savings that network computing will allow its inevitable adoption by academic institutions. I'd like to first talk about the continued acceleration of the concept of common content. And lastly, I'd like to talk about the integration of IT into the planning process and encourage you all to appoint a Chief Information Officer at your institution. So let's go ahead, John, and start talking about the first point there, and the focus on the learner.
Jerry?
Yes?
Yeah, just take a breath, okay?
Okay.
Thank you. All right, next slide is up.
Okay. So the focus on the learner. Personalization of the learning experience controlled by the user, I think, is one of the key elements here, especially as it regards adult learning. And basically, by the time a student gets to law school, you've got to consider them an adult and not learning the same way we learned as children. Now, one of the things that we've learned at Sun Microsystems in terms of adult learning, and you can probably appreciate this moment as you're sitting in that seat there, is the fact that when you're in a live classroom situation, if someone is teaching you something that you already know, I think the reactions basically boil down into 2 camps. You're either bored or you're angry, and sometimes a combination of the two. But the model that we've had for over 1,000 years of the instructor-led training with the subject matter expert in the front of the class and the students passively sitting in chairs, sort of the John Houseman kind of model we think about, I think is greatly enhanced by the web because you can now personalize that learning experience. In my previous job to being the academic programs person at Sun Microsystems, I actually did train the sales force at Sun Microsystems. And one of the advantages we discovered very early on was by putting content on the web and learning on the web, you actually allow the learner to learn the information and review it at their own pace. So, for example, a student from Korea can listen to an English audio file 5 or 6 times until they understand it, where someone in the United States may only need 1 time. But that's certainly a crucial piece of the model, is to be able to learn and review at your own pace. And another thing that we actually have found very beneficial is this idea of self-assessment and online assistance. Let me give you an example of something that came several years ago. It actually involves a tire company. Fortunately, it is not Firestone, it's Goodyear. But I was talking to the CIO of Goodyear about distributed learning, and she asked me if there was any way that she could use distributed learning to increase the skills of her largely Fortran and COBOL-based programming IT environment at Goodyear. And she was very worried about this being a new CIO. She thought that perhaps she would lose many employees who felt threatened by her attempt to move Goodyear into a more IP-oriented kind of environment. And so one of the things that turned out to be most effective in retrospect was the self-assessment test that she put online at Goodyear that allowed all her IT employees to go in and assess themselves in private, secretly, nobody watching, and look at where they were currently and where they needed to be to meet the minimum level of her expectations in terms of their knowledge of internet protocol and the web, and to assess on their own whether they could make that transition from the older ways of programming to the newer ways of programming in IT. And in doing so, she removed herself from being the bad guy. In this particular environment, the individual in the privacy of their own home, for example, or perhaps the privacy of their own hotel room here, could self-assess themselves and really find out, what they lack, and in many cases go online to acquire those skills. And so they were able to go back there and say, yes, I want to sign up. I can make this transition and count me in. So that aspect of self-assessments turned out to be very good. And also the idea of being able to get online assistance has proven to be a very good enhancement to the learning experience that is used in the web environment, in the fact that, if you're on the web and you don't have access to that individual to clarify issues or ask questions, we have shown that is simply not as beneficial a learning experience as being in a real classroom. So the ability to put that online assistance and counseling and stuff is important to a class. That can be done asynchronously or synchronously by email, chat room, number of different ways of doing it, but certainly has turned out to be important. In the area of self-assessment, and another point of view here I'd like to raise, is that I've seen many organizations actually design a custom curriculum for each individual learner by going through a simple assessment of their skills currently, and then asking them where they would like to be in a year on a scale of 1 to 5. So, for example, let's say knowledge of the Solaris operating system, one of my new SEs comes in with a knowledge of 2 and decides at the end of the year they want to have a 4 level of knowledge. What we've done within the Suntan distance learning engine is to map that against the curriculum such that if you want to go to a 2 and a 4, my system will come back and tell you to take 2 web-based classes and go to a real live class and sit there for 5 days. If you wanted to go from a 1 to a 2, for example, you might get a simple web page. And if you want to go from a 1 to 5, you're probably going to get 2 to 3 years of solid curriculum, set off to talk to people, go to trade shows, read this, and you can see how that kind of assessment of where you are now and where you'd like to be in a year allows you to self-tailor a learning experience for the student that keeps them interested and engaged the whole time, because what they're learning is stuff that they don't already know. And in fact, if you look back, what I would say is teach people only enough of what they already know to place what you're about to teach them in some context that they can put into that mental map that all of us, remember things by. The next point I'd like to make is about search engines, and certainly from watching the evolution of search engines through the old Waze search engine, then the first sort of one on the web was Lycos, and then we got Excite and things like that. What I've noticed with engines like Excite and Google and Ask Jeeves is today those engines have gotten so good that there really isn't the need to remember a lot of the facts that we used to remember in the past. If you have access to a browser and you can access a search engine, you can actually, type in the question, and it will give you the answer in the first 4 or 5 responses. Recently, my wife and I were sharing a peanut butter sandwich, and right in the middle of eating that sandwich, she said, I wonder where peanut butter came from. I was able to go into the office in the back. I have DSL, so I'm sort of always on, And within about a minute, I was able to get an answer just by typing the question, what is the history of peanut butter, into a search engine. Now how does this impact us? Well, if you apply the concept of a computer to the human brain, as you get older, your RAM tends to go down rather than go up. And so the need to fill your head with facts that may change very rapidly or often is probably not a good use of that RAM. And so by using search engines, you can actually, if you can remember the URL to the search engine, you can actually certainly not need to remember facts so much anymore because they're right there at your fingertips. And actually, in teaching internet classes, I've known that I think it allows us as professors certainly a lot more in control and flexibility in dealing with diverse student types and learning styles. In my class at Santa Clara, I have a highly diverse audience, quite a few Hispanics and Asians, in addition to a lot of people actually from India. And what I notice is that by putting a certain amount of pre-reading online before each of my lectures or guest lectures, I can bring the entire level of the class up to a higher starting point than I was able to in the past before the web. Because if you realize a lot of the time the starter class is spent doing administrivia and level setting. If you sent the administrivia out by email about noon of the day of my night class, I found that many of my students were already prepared by the time they got to class at 7:30 with what I wanted to talk about, and that saved me 10 minutes right there. And so I certainly think that those of you that have used the internet and the web in your class have seen the opportunity to deal with each individual student in the way that they like to be dealt with. And so let's move on to the next foil, if we could, and talk a little bit about wireless on campus. And certainly part of this paradigm change, part of this opportunity that Alvin Toffler was talking about in his quote, has to do with the changing paradigm of learning. And that is, in the past, for thousands of years, we've really sort of had to go to a place to learn. In the case of Suffolk Law School that you're sitting in right now, to learn law, you go to a place, it's probably room 235 or 215 or something like that. With the wireless that we're starting to see emerge, learning follows you. And just to give you an example of that, I was over in Sweden recently meeting with some professors that are doing some Java research for me at the University of Gävle, which is about 2 hours north of Stockholm. And during the course of a dinner one evening in this town, we started talking about Marshall McLuhan and the book from a while back called The Media's Message. And no one could really remember around the table if Marshall McLuhan was even alive or not yet. And in the past, that's the type of question that you would have just sort of looked at each other, realized that nobody knew the answer, and gone right on with your conversation. But one of the professors actually had his Nokia 9110 phone there, which is a phone that's not available here in the United States yet, but basically it's a combination of a computer and a cell phone. The cell phone is built into the back of the LCD screen. It sort of opens up like a little clamshell, and you have a keyboard inside, and it's not much larger than your current cell phone if you have a fairly average-sized cell phone. In the course of just having the discussion over dinner, within about a minute and 45 seconds, he was able to log on, bring up Google, type in that question, and announce that, in fact, Marshall McLuhan had been dead for 10 years. And so that idea about learning following you, rather than you having to go to a library or look that up or wait till you get home and whatever, is a very, very key paradigm that I think that we need to explore more about how learning follows you rather than you having to go to, for learning to some physical location. And the thing that we've also found from some of the schools that have already implemented wireless into their campus infrastructures is it's actually a lot less costly to wire classrooms and dorms and courtrooms and things like that. You need to improve the speed and bandwidth of internet access. As long as you're going to do it, you might as well retrofit it with wireless rather than pulling fiber or more, UTP-5, cable or something like that. That in fact, in some cases, it's as much as 40% cheaper than pulling wire, especially in some of the older classrooms and dorms and things like that. It just doesn't make sense to do it with wire anymore. And so wireless will actually probably be the effective way to do what in telco is called the last mile, but in wireless is called the last 500 feet, simply because of the range of 802.11b right now. But That is certainly another aspect of wireless is it's going to be less expensive. And I think that those of you that have already tried wireless in your campuses have noticed that the quality of learning experience has been improved, particularly when it comes to collaborative exercises, because not all people have to be in the same place anymore. To give an advantage that we might see out there in Palo Alto with Stanford, you could probably be in a dorm, in the law school library, even eating sushi on University Boulevard, and still do collaborative research in real time with other people on your team because you're all connected by a public wireless LAN network. And the other thing that I've noticed in using wireless myself in my office building, my office building at Sun is actually built with the 802.11b wireless technology as well. I have a little Cisco PCM CIA card here that I slip into my laptop, and it gives me excellent bandwidth in the building. The thing I've noticed is when, in particular, it comes to learning, when I try to take my learning at my networked computer on my desk, I used to get interrupted all the time by phone calls or employees coming down the hallway and popping their head into my office and things like that. It was never possible to spend quality time taking learning. And I think the thing I've seen about wireless is I can take my laptop and my wireless card and go into the men's restroom, put myself in a stall back there, and have absolute quiet for up to 45 minutes to take the learning I need to take. So wireless does allow us to actually improve the quality of the learning experience, both in terms of accessing a place that is a good learning space and in terms of collaboration. And I think that you'll see over time here, especially in the next probably year to 18 months, as we start to see some of these 2.5, 3G, 4G technologies rolling out over here, that wireless devices will be both easier to use and more useful than they are today. I think we're going to see a consolidation of functionality on some sort of device that probably is some sort of cell phone or PDA, but will be far more useful than it is today. One of the things I noticed in particular in the cell phone I'm looking at right now, the screen is about 1.5 inches wide and 1 inch high, and you'd wonder how you'd get a browser into that screen that would be effective for any means, and we want to use it for learning. But I have seen research being done right down the hallway from me at Sun Microsystems in which they're using Bluetooth between a cell phone and a flat panel display on the wall such that you can download the file through the cell phone and display it using Bluetooth onto a flat panel wireless device on the wall that's 3 feet by 4 feet. So the idea that we need to have the large browser in some sort of cellular or wireless device that we're going to use really is a sort of a limited kind of thinking, that in the world we're going to here, we are going to disaggregate things like the browser screen from the cell phone and be able to use those both very, very effectively. In fact, my last trip to Sweden, I actually found a community over there that is experimenting with switched 500 megabit per second wireless bandwidth to each and every device. Now, if all of you understand what 500 megabits per second is, I can assure you that anything you'd like to download or watch video in real time, you can do with 500 megabit per second. I mean, I can remember days when the backbone network of the phone system was nowhere near that kind of speed. So that's what I have to say about wireless. Let's move on to the issue of faculty involvement in IT. And I think that one of the great things that economic downturn does for people is it really allows them an opportunity to go back to school. Because you've all heard the phrase, when the going gets tough, the tough go back to school. And we're noticing that certainly in MBA schools out in Silicon Valley, my classroom is filling up much more rapidly now and is much larger than it was in the last few years, because many people that were working in these .com companies instead of trying to find another job are actually seeing the opportunity to go back and improve their skill level. And I think this evidences a sort of an adoption of the continuous learning model. And I think the continuous learning model is something that's going to be necessary for all of us to be successful in the world. And I talk to many people about this, and I actually run into a lot of people that claim they don't do continuous learning. And I would assert that really what you're doing right now sitting in that seat is continuous learning, but even more importantly, every time you use a search engine, you are really doing continuous learning that just happens to be just in time. And the second point here is I think that students today are going to want IT in the classroom, things like wireless and stuff, and in fact, it's becoming a competitive factor in their selection of schools. And I think that's one of the reasons as administrators and faculty members of law schools, you really need to sort of understand that one of the ways you're going to compete is by to offer the most sophisticated and most advanced infrastructure for these students, because they're certainly going to expect it. One of the advantages of my job, I get to go out on the road quite a bit, and I was in Minneapolis, Minnesota last month with Jesse Ventura and John Morgridge, and we were actually talking to a group of about 450 high school students. And it's amazing the technology literacy that these students already have at a very, very young age. In fact, it really sort of takes me to my third point there, that as faculty members and administrators, we really don't have to set up the technology anymore. Students will happily do that for us. We just have to be able to use and incorporate the technology in things like content creation to really be effective as faculty members. In talking to these high school kids, I often tell them that I have the opportunity to talk to their teachers, what would you like me to tell them? And universally, around the world, the message is, stop screwing with the technology. We'll go intercept the classroom in 2 minutes, and then we can get on with it and learn, rather than you taking 10 to 15 minutes trying to get it hooked up and detracting from our learning time. So I would say, as a message to the faculty out there, this is a perfect time for you to go back and improve your own skills in technology, because, as we said a little bit earlier, the internet is not going away, the web is not going away. It's going to get a lot easier to use, but faculty members at any kind of skill level will be able to use the web, because what we're finding is the model of programming itself is changing. With things like Java and other object-oriented programming languages, you can create little modules of reusable code. And I've actually seen applications out there where individuals that know absolutely nothing about programming can create their own applications by combining reusable code that other people have written. And so this is particularly true, for example, and illustrated by the generation of custom reports. We use reusable code in Java in particular at Sun Microsystems. I have a little application. I can look at sales of E10000s in Europe by simply dragging a little icon that says E10000 Europe and sales into a little box, and it goes back and lunges through all the data, figures out what Jerry Neece wants, and delivers that to me very quickly. So the idea about, for people to say, technology is too tough for me, I can never use it. I'm probably a classic example of someone that cannot use the technology very well, except for perhaps a cell phone or a wireless card or something, but certainly am able to use it. And I certainly encourage faculty to improve their skilling during this particular time, because as Al Rogers once said, in time of profound change, the learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. Now, if we can move on to the next foil here, I'd like to talk just a little bit about the network computing model. And network computers, for those of you that are not familiar, are actually the client component of a networked architecture. It's beyond the concept of client-server, but these network computers essentially provide functionality at a minimum cost and at a maximum simplicity. Examples of that would be the Sunray product that Sun Microsystems sells. Compaq is a product in that area. Oracle has a network computer, and of course I would consider most any kind of PDA or cell phone a network computer as well. But the primary advantage of these kind of network computing devices are the flexibility they give you in the types of content you deliver. The total cost of ownership, in particular over time, goes down as you employ network computing. And just to give you an example of that many of you can relate to, I'm sure some of you are considering implementing Microsoft's next version of Office on your campuses. And look at what it's going to take in terms of cost to get that implemented. In some campuses that aren't networked too well, it's actually a means of going around with a stack of CDs and putting them into the CD drive of each PC and loading it up. And that takes a tremendous amount of time. In a network computing model, you load that application on the server one time, and then everybody that's attached to that has the advantage of using that application. And so the first time you do it, it's good. The second time you have to do it, it's great, because when you go and update the application, or even just change and put patches in it or something, the next time an individual comes into that server, they're getting the latest copy without having to do anything on their end. So total cost of ownership is better. Actually, I think security is better from what I've noticed using the Sunray in my desk the last year and a half. And I think one of the big advantages for faculty and administrators is in the area of system management and control. Many of us have problems finding skilled people to run our own infrastructures on campus because, the private sector can pay much more than many universities in keeping these skilled people. So one of the ways to simplify the university system management needs is to actually go to a network computing model where these days a handful of people can manage an enormous network through a combination of remote systems management and actually using this network computing model, so you don't have to walk around to each and every PC to make these kinds of changes. Another thing, in going around and talking to students that have actually been using these Sunrays for some period of time, I found a very interesting thing. In fact, I'll describe an experience I had a few months ago in Carrollton, Georgia, where the Carrollton School District has about 1,000 Sunrays and have been experimenting them for over a year. And I was out there one morning. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. I was in the school library with several people. And in the library, it was a circular room, large circular room. There were 40 Dells on one end of the room and 40 Sunrays on the other. And lo and behold, the bell rings at 8 o'clock. At 8:01, in pour 100 fifth grade students. And the amazing thing was they all ran to the Sunrays, and it looked like a game of musical chairs. The ones that couldn't get into the seats in front of the Sunrays reluctantly went over and sat in the seats in front of the Dells. And as a marketing person, I looked at this and I said, there's something going on here that potentially is very significant. So I went up to the little 11-year-olds and asked them why they went to the Sunrays. And it was really apparent very quickly. Through a concept that we call hot desking, the network computers are always on. And so when you put your smart card into the smart card reader of the Sunray, your page immediately comes up where you left it yesterday or the last time you visited the system, rather than having to go through a minute to 2 minute login procedure to boot up your PC, bring your application up and start. And since, as many of you have kids know, the attention span of kids is very, very short, and the sooner they can get into what they think they should be doing, the better they like it. The other thing I've heard from faculty members is that they like Sunrays because they're quiet. In fact, the person that told me this said, "No, Jerry, the reason I like Sunrays is I don't have to raise my voice in the classroom." Because if you think about it, one of the loudest noises in the classrooms, other than students sleeping in the back of the class, is the sound of the fans on the PCs in these lab kinds of environments. And you find yourself as a professor having to talk rather loudly to talk over this constant hum. That sort of sounds like an air conditioner in a hotel room, but it's just enough to allow you to have to raise your voice. And since the Sunray, there is no CPU inside the device on your desk, that CPU is actually sitting back on the server along with the operating system. There's no need to cool that CPU on your desk, and therefore those devices are very, very quiet. And I think that those kinds of network computers may be the vehicle which overcomes many of the perceptual barriers that in particular older adults have to using PCs and therefore using those PCs for e-learning. And as I say, we're not just talking about Sunrays here, we're actually talking about a lot of other devices. And I was encouraged to read last week that the Nokia 9210 and 9290, the 9290 being the US version, will be available here by the end of this calendar year. And so we will have the advantage of having those next generation cellular phones with the ability to act as a network computer. If we can move on to the next point now, let's talk about this idea of more common content, because that is another area that's drastically going to reduce the cost for many schools out there. And I think the CALI lessons that you can see online are a very, very good example. How many courses on drafting contracts using shall, may, and must do you really need? It doesn't make sense for every university out there to write their own. You really just need one, and that's the one that Deborah Coleman has put online there on CALI. So I think the idea of having common content really allows professors to spend less time developing content that's fairly basic and spend more time on their specialties and developing stuff they're interested in. And so by using other people's content and leveraging that, it actually, I think, makes me as an instructor more happy because I'm spending less time typing up stuff that I already know or that I think other people know as well. Common content we also finds a very consistent method of teaching, and in teaching law, that is obviously in providing an application of the law. If everybody is reading the same thing, not a version that's 95% similar to the next version, then you have a much more chance of having a consistent understanding of a particular law or area of law because you do use this common content. And I actually think that this also changes the role of the person in front of the class quite a bit. I've noticed that my role in front of the classroom has changed from the subject matter expert of being the person has a lot of knowledge standing in front of a classroom, transmitting that knowledge to people who I assume have less knowledge than me, but isn't always true, to one of becoming a facilitator. And let me give you an example of that from my own classroom. In teaching electronic commerce to MBA students at night in Silicon Valley, obviously many of the people in that class are product managers and things like that on the web and the internet as well. And in fact, as recently as 2 years ago, I found that on 3 of my 16 subject areas during the evenings, there were students within my class that knew far more than I would ever know about those 3 subjects. And so I found that I ended up letting them teach the class, and I sat in the back of the room as a student. But the thing that you see is that if you use content that is online, you can actually use that as the subject matter expert. And then the role of the professor changes to one of a facilitator to explain the stuff on the screen, to clarify and answer questions of the student, things like that. And if you look at the difference in skill levels required for a facilitator versus a subject matter expert, what it means is a lot more people are going to be a lot more comfortable being facilitators because they will not have to have the skill level, won't undergo the stress of wondering whether they know more than their students. And as I said a few minutes ago, we found that common content greatly reduces the cost in many areas by you not having to reinvent some class or module that already exists out there. And I think that what we're seeing here is a new differentiator in academia of the group of people we'll call content creators versus another group of people I'll call content consumers. And you may actually see the role of the 4-year universities be to create content that the 2-year universities like community colleges and technical schools will then consume, because the cost model of their operation is obviously much different than a 4-year school, and they literally cannot afford to create a lot of new content and still do a good job of teaching. Let's move on to the last point now, and that is the issue of getting CIOs and getting involved strategically in the technology in your university and your law school. My first point would be to be careful of what you outsource, because while certainly one of the most popular things of the application service provider model is to be able to outsource the hosting of your website, one thing you cannot outsource is the planning and control of your IT operation and your infrastructure. And so, since you can't outsource that, obviously you have to bring the skills in-house, and I think that is really the role of bringing on a CIO in your university. To understand technology's impact, not both on your business, that is, delivering law knowledge, and on instructional design. I think that's particularly essential, especially for a faculty to have, to understand the impacts of the web and the internet and some of these new technologies on the business of instruction. And so I don't want to steal any thunder here, but I would certainly invite you to attend Mitch Davis's and Pablo Molina's presentation at 12:30 today. If I look at my schedule here, that will be given, let's see, that's breakout 1 at 12:30 to 1:30. I'd certainly encourage you to go and listen to their experiences, because I think that you'll find that they're very enlightening and certainly will help you get more of what you want with your own administrations. So, let's move on now to look at the issues that still remain. And the first issue is, I think one of them that we've all got wrapped up in, it needs to actually work, not just look cool. Because as we're seeing, that it's not the brilliance of the technologies per se, but the brilliance that those technologies are utilized that really makes a difference. And quite a bit has been written on this subject. An individual by the name of Yogesh Malhotra was the first one to write on that subject, but certainly a lot of other people are writing on the fact that today we would be better served by learning how to effectively use the technology we have, rather than let me give you an example. My wife, being a federal public defender in San Jose, her boss, who runs the office, calls me up last week and says, Jerry, and he must know he knows very little about PCs. Jerry, I have an 800 megahertz CPU in my machine right now. I see it thrive. They now have these 1500 megahertz machines. Should I upgrade and get one? Lupe, what do you use it for? He says, well, I use it for word processing. Occasionally I'll do a spreadsheet. And of course, you can do that with a 300 baud modem and a 25 megahertz CPU. You certainly don't need 1500 megahertz. So the idea that technology is cool, you need the next latest version of the powerful technology, I think is losing a lot of its glow. Certainly today we have machines that will do just about anything. What we need to do is learn how to focus on the performance of utilizing those technologies rather than simply being locked into getting the next coolest thing. The next thing that I think that is an issue here is that expertise and good customer service, whether it's a student or a retail consumer, is not easily downloadable. While there are a handful of people that operate quite comfortably in the area of e-commerce and buying stuff on the web, most people still like that aspect of hand-holding and the safety net that if they want to do returns or have questions that they can actually talk to a real-life human being. And so while people charge off and put this technology into the infrastructures, you can't do that without also looking at providing the proper help desk and support for your students so that they can use that technology. And in fact, it's sort of a point that I raised a few foils ago. I think the focus this next year should really be on the faculty's IT skills, not the students. And in the past, we focused a lot on students, but really, around the world, I see that today's students have absolutely no problems using nearly any kind of technology we can throw at them. And really, where the real issue right now is to improve the faculty's IT skills so that they can make better use of the technology in providing their content to students who are more than prepared and adequate to understand it from a technological perspective. But while doing that, I certainly think we need to take the privacy and security issues into a very real and prominent position, because that is the biggest holdback right now to e-commerce in particular, and I think education is the issue of security and privacy. For a student to be able to come online from a remote location and take an assessment test, and we actually know because we've done some sort of security handshake with them that they are who they say they are. And from another perspective, I think we're going to see this concept of an electronic transcript start to take hold in education in the next few years and over the next 20 years, where a student starting in perhaps junior high school will actually start getting sort of an electronic report card and build a portfolio of the work they've done online, and that will follow them through their entire career, and they will just add to that portfolio as they go. One of my current assignments at Sun Microsystems is dealing very much with Cisco Networking Academy, where they use a web browser delivery of information enhanced by an instructor in the class to act as a facilitator model. But there's an Adobe web design class that they'll be introducing in the fall here in North America, and the actual case study, quote-unquote, that they do in that class as high schoolers is to build 15 web pages that now become their electronic portfolio, so that when they go out to get a job, they are not handing someone a paper resume of their skills. They can actually encourage the hirer to log on, look at their pages online, again, at a secure site that Cisco provides, and to look at the work they've actually done in the class. And I think those kinds of trends we'll see a lot more of, but we can't forget the importance of security and privacy for the student and faculty and in the institution as we roll out these infrastructures. I think we need to formalize a culture of continuous learning at a very early age and really reinforce that with some of us more gerontologically, or whatever the word is, age-challenged people that weren't brought up with technology. I think that we need to all adopt more of this culture of continuous learning so that we're constantly improving our skills, learning new facts, learning new ways of doing our profession, learning more about how to use the technology on a day-to-day basis as we go along. I also think that we need to certainly have a little bit more respect for intellectual property law, which is in the domain of many of you people in the room there. I recently got a call from my department chair saying, Jerry, I'd like you to go online and take a look at these 5 papers that were turned into my class, because I think they were turned into your class last semester. And I thought about that for a while. In my old school way of thinking, I would have looked at that as plagiarism, something wrong, kicked the student out of school. But I thought, what we're really talking about here is leverage, not necessarily plagiarism. If the student had the intelligence to write a paper that would suffice for 2 different classes, I think that's a good thing for the student and not necessarily something that we should punish them for. And lastly, I don't think that we can forget that there is a certain aspect of social resources here that create the context for learning. As John Brown has said here, that we have spent over $1 trillion on technology in the last 20 years, but very little has realized any improvement in the efficiency of knowledge workers. And virtually none of that money has been spent on their effectiveness. And really what we need to do going forward is to solve the problems of assimilation of a new technology, and only then will these billions of dollars we've been spending on technology be truly useful, because then everyone will be able to use them. So that's basically the issues I wanted to talk about here, and I'd like to move on and actually reintroduce a foil that I ended with last year and started with this year, that looking to the future, the only thing that is predictable is change. And that massive change can come from unknown directions, as we so clearly saw this year. And therefore, I would continue to encourage you to re-engineer your schools and your faculty and your students and your technological infrastructure to be agile, to be modular, to be able to be built on open standards so it can be changed very quickly, and to use outsourcing where appropriate. But change is inevitable, and we're going to get it from a lot of directions. And if we can move to the last foil, one of my favorite quotes is still from Peter Senge at MIT. The only sustainable competitive advantage that you may have in the corporate sector, or certainly in competing law schools, is to learn faster than your competition. And really, if we move to my last foil, I think that what has changed since the last year I put this foil up is we want to create a sustainable competitive advantage to improve the performance and efficiency of our people. And I think that the next generation learning management systems that I have started to see hit the marketplace incorporate this aspect of performance and learning, in that they basically do skills assessment, and they teach you only what you need to know to remove the obstacles and barriers to the performance of your current job. And in that kind of environment, learning makes a great deal of sense to an organization, in that you're not boring people by teaching stuff they already know. You're only teaching them stuff and prioritizing it in a way that you improve their performance and efficiency on what you're asking them to do today. And so it has been a wonderful hour here. I thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you, whatever way we did it. I certainly had a lot of fun talking on the phone. The only thing that I really missed here is the opportunity to interact with you and see your faces. I'm getting a little tired of looking at myself in the mirror here. But on the last foil there, you'll see my email address, jerry.neece@eng.sun.com. jerry.neece@sun.com will also work. And my phone number is there as well. And while it will be very difficult to take questions and answers right now, if you do have questions and answers or comments, please feel free to mail them to me at that email address, and I'll be happy to answer them over the course of the next week or so. So once again, thank you very much, John, for inviting me. I certainly wish I could be there in person, but it's certainly been a wonderful experience. I hope it came off all right on your end. Thank you very much.
Jerry, thank you very much. Well, you're quite a trooper for pulling this together under the circumstances. I really appreciate it. I'm not in any of the live rooms either, and so I hope there's raucous applause happening as we speak.
Well, I'll tell you, John, the first time I taught my class electronically at Santa Clara, because traffic didn't allow me to get to class that night, I was actually able to see them in the classroom, and what happened is, when they realized I wasn't there physically, they all got up and left. So I was adopting that old model of education that I used when I was undergraduate. If it was boring in the first 5 minutes, I'm off to the beach.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Jerry, thank you so much. And folks, it's time for a break, and this will be the last time we'll be meeting in plenary. So enjoy the rest of the day, and I look forward to seeing you next year in Chicago.